is really very dark over there, bub. Let's fix that before you get comfortable.
That fix it, Ziggy? Looking a little bit better? Yeah, I like it. What's up, my wizards? It's Dev here along with my dude, Ziggy, from Mtg. We like it in Magic, and today, lots of big old news, it turns out. Bans in standards, suspensions in historic, and they completely changed the way the companion mechanic works to begin with, so we got a lot to discuss. Let's go ahead and get to that.
Yo, I'm sorting through some heinous haters like a pooper scooper. I'm just trying to take my life like a Koopa Trooper. I'm Double Mario, that mean I'm super. And I'm freaking dangerous like a Chupa Cabre. Got them all day like a Kanye, but I'm way better getting cheddar in Monterey. But Jack, you don't know, man. You got the show, man. You want roast beef? Well, I'm Arby's.
And we're back. Now, I want to go ahead and burn through the actual news portion of this because I imagine a lot of you have already seen the announcement from Wizards and all the talk about it on social media and stuff today. But just in case you're not hip to this yet, in Standard, they have banned Agent of Treachery and Fires of Invention. In Historic, those cards are suspended. Wizards says they're going to monitor things and see if the format is healthy enough to allow those cards sometime later in the future. But in Standard, they banned for good. And that's actually really awesome. These are the two cards I wanted to be banned the most. I guess Teferi probably could have gone with them, and I wouldn't have been upset about that, but I'll focus on the good for now. I'm happy that both of these cards are banned. Now, in the case of Fires of Invention, I'm glad this one is gone because right now there are 3 or 4 decks at the top of the meta that are all built around this same mana advantage engine that's so powerful it effectively doubles your mana on every turn after that, and even allows you to use the rest of your mana on like activated abilities and whatnot. It's just insanely powerful, and it probably shouldn't have been printed into a standard legal set anyway because it's just such a ridiculous mana advantage piece. So I'm kind of glad this one is gone. As Wizards said, it does place deck building restraints on what players can do in standard because there's not much you can do that's better than a Fires of Invention. In the case of Agent of Treachery, this is just an annoying piece of garbage that I'm glad is gone. It's just really annoying, but it's also in a few decks at the top of the meta right now. This is the best thing Winota decks do, and I do think that even though Winota decks can still see some play, they're effectively DOA at the top tables, especially in formats like Best of One, where Winota has been dominating for a while now, and has really shown her prowess over the weekend when we got to see the Best of One event on Arena. Winota was freaking everywhere, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that Winota can pull an Agent of Treachery from out of nowhere and just win the game on turn 3 or 4. So it's a ridiculous interaction, and I doubt Winota can do anything even anywhere near as powerful as that. Same thing is true for the Luca decks, although I don't think Luca is completely dead in the water either, and people will try different stuff with Luca. Agent of Treachery is just the game-winning play in that deck that it's really hard to come back from in a lot of cases. So I'm fairly certain that these Luca decks are nowhere near as powerful without Agent of Treachery, and that's not a very controversial or hard to figure out statement, right? These Luca decks can still pull things like Enrace Forerunners out of nowhere, which could be a pretty sweet thing to do. They can go get a Yadaro and swing with a hasty 8/8. That's, trample. That's fine, but it doesn't end the game the way an Agent of Treachery does. So I can see the Luca decks trying to do stuff like Enrace Forerunners, but even that isn't anywhere near as powerful as an Agent. But let's get to that other bit of news before I really start talking about like where we go from here, because the other bit of news is just as important as the bannings, and that is the changes to the way the companion mechanic works. Now, what Wizards has decided to implement here in order to decrease the meta share of companion decks, that's exactly what they've said, is that rather than being able to just play your companion out of your sideboard whenever it would be legal to do so, now you can pay 3 mana, doesn't matter what color, just pay 3 mana, and you put your companion into your hand from your sideboard. Now, I think that this rule change really does severely hinder some companions, although not all. For instance, Lurrus. I think that Lurrus is kind of caught in the middle here because I think that there's going to be a lot of times where you still end up getting a lot of value out of Lurrus, but this will effectively back up your Lurrus by a turn, and Standard Magic especially is a game of turns, so having to spend your mana that way might actually be a huge deal for some of these decks that are really low on the curve, like Lurrus decks. So, similarly, by the way, while we're talking about decks that are low on the curve, Obosh aggro decks, especially the mono red Obosh aggro deck, is probably nowhere near as good as it once was now that it's backed up by a turn, and you can't just play Obosh on turn 5 anymore. However, I think one of the hottest companions in Standard is not actually that affected by this announcement, and that's Yorion, because we see a lot of Yorion control decks in this format right now, and they're kind of unfazed by having to pay an extra 3 mana. They have to do it at sorcery speed, which does kind of hurt, but at the same time, I think that if you're trying to like gauge which companions are least affected by this, Yorion is right at the top of that list. I think an important thing to note about Yorion, though, while I've still got it on screen, is that it might be more impacted by the ban announcements than it was by the rules changes for Companion. I mean, yes, the rules changes for Companion do affect it on some level. It makes all the Companions slightly less playable. Again, control decks won't want to spend 3 mana at sorcery speed to just put this in their hand. There are issues there, but when it comes to the ban announcements, 2 cards that Yorion really likes got banned. You know, one of the best tricks in Standard right now, or I guess as of yesterday, was to be able to play a free spell with Fires of Invention, play Yorion for free, wipe your fires for the turn, and suddenly your 2 spell per turn limit is no more, so you get to play as many spells as you want. That was a great trick. And not having that in Standard anymore, again, severely impacts the playability of Yorion. And I shouldn't have to tell you that not being able to blink your Agent of Treachery with Yorion probably impacts the playability of Yorion too, but I still think that this is a very good companion, and we might be going back to the days of blue-white control, or perhaps Bant control, being one of the best decks in Standard, and I can see those decks still carrying Yorion as a companion. But now it's time to talk about sort of where we go from here. What specific cards am I looking at to either fill vacuums left by the banning of these cards or just get better, you know, in the wake of these bannings? What decks get better? What decks stay the same? All that. Well, a couple of cards that I want to point out before I get to sort of what I think the meta is going to end up looking like, because that's a real crapshoot. But the card that I want to point out straight away is Mass Manipulation. There's still going to be a bunch of Simic or maybe Bant ramp decks in this format. You know, Euro didn't go anywhere, and Euro kind of got better in some ways, considering it's not going to be able to get stolen by an Agent of Treachery. So that's pretty sweet. You know, Euro didn't go anywhere. It's still one of the best cards in Standard. Nissa didn't go anywhere. Still one of the best. We were talking about banning Nissa a few months ago. Remember those good old days? Teferi not going anywhere, sadly, for some. So I think blue-white or Bant are still both amazing deck choices. And rather than play a card like Agent of Treachery, maybe they'll just end up playing a copy or two of Mass Manipulation, because it can still be like super freaking annoying, like impossible to come back from, especially considering Agent of Treachery will still like 1 thing or maybe 2 things if you're able to blink it that turn with a Thassa or something. But Mass Manipulation in the late game can just still like 3 or 4 things, and it's demoralizing. So I would expect this card to maybe show up a little bit more often, fair warning. Now, the next specific card that I want to point out isn't a card that I think is going to see more play. It's a card I want to point out because I think it's going to see less play, and that's Deafening Clarion. With no Fires of Invention decks in the format, I really think we're going to see this card take a nosedive in not playability, but just amount of play it's actually seeing. Jeskai could be a thing, some sort of Jeskai control deck, and if it is, it'll play Deafening Clarion. As a matter of fact, I think if Jeskai control is a thing, it'll be because it has access to a sweeper like Deafening Clarion. But as it is, with Fires of Invention exiting the format, I could see a world where there's just a lot less of this card going around, so aggro could get even more powerful. Now, in terms of what decks might get better in this brave new world, I've already mentioned Bant control, blue-white control. I think those are great contenders for being some of the best decks in the format. You know, Bant Yorion and blue-white Yorion are already some of the best decks in the format. They don't really lose much in this announcement. They don't lose much in this rules change either. Again, I'm skeptical that Yorion is affected a lot by these changes, even though I will admit that Yorion is affected some. But still, I think that blue-white control decks that carry things like Dovin's Veto and Dream Trawler and whatnot, and sweepers, they're still going to be really dominant decks in this format, possibly even more so now. Aside from that, though, I definitely think the just mono red deck with Embercleave probably looks pretty good right now. You know, we don't really want to play Obosh in our aggro decks anymore. Backing those decks up by a turn so that they can just put their Obosh in their hand is really a death knell in a lot of situations for those aggro decks. You know, aggro decks win in as few turns as possible. So, you know, it was already kind of a problem to have to wait until turn 5 to put your Obosh in play. Now you're going to have to wait until turn 6, and that probably kills those decks. So I think we probably just go back to the Embercleave deck, honestly. Especially, again, with fewer Deafening Clarions in the format, Mono Red looks a lot better nowadays. But so does, for that matter, Wrackdos Sacrifice. Perhaps even Jund Sacrifice. I'm not sure which one, but fewer Deafening Clarions is also pretty good for this deck. But so is fewer Fires of Invention, fewer Agents of Treachery. Everything about this announcement seems pretty decent for the Wrackdos Sacrifice decks. A lot of these didn't necessarily want to play a companion to begin with unless they played Obosh, and these decks aren't necessarily as aggro-oriented as decks like, Mardu Knights, for instance, that wanted to play Lurrus. This deck would usually want to play Obosh, but since it's not as aggro, it might be able to create the space to put the Obosh in its hand and still get value out of it. Wrackdos Sacrifice, Jund Sacrifice, these are both decks that are much more oriented towards setup and payoff than they are towards just getting damage in as quickly as possible. So I don't think they're as affected by the rules change vis-a-vis Obosh. Wrackdos Sacrifice decks could also be a pretty good foil for the aggro decks in the format, given that Mayhem Devil and Judith are both great at picking off these small aggro creatures, and do so kind of a lot. So I would look to see these decks take a rise in the next month or so. But before I get to the deck that I think is on top of the format, just de facto the best deck in the format after these announcements, I want to talk about a couple of decks that I'm actually not sure whether or not they get better or get worse. First of all, the Lira Cycling deck. Now, this deck might not even play Lurrus anymore after this announcement. It might be completely null and void to play that as your companion. And if that is the case, I think the deck just gets worse, probably, but it might still be worth playing Lurrus in the Cycling deck. That said, I will say that if we do see the more control list actually playing counterspells in this format to fill the void of Fires of Invention decks that effectively can't play counterspells because you can't play spells in your opponent's turn. So I think we probably will see more counterspells, and Zenith Flare players really don't like to face a barrage of counterspells. So it depends on where the meta goes from here, but I'm not sure that Cycling gets much better or much worse, but it probably trends towards slightly worse with the loss of its companion and the possible rise of counterspells. Another deck that I'm not really sure what happens to it is Sultan Mutai. Now, one of the big advantages to these Mutate decks was that as long as you mutate onto a Paradise Druid, you're effectively protected from Agent of Treachery. Now, Agent of Treachery is no longer in the format, so the deck isn't protected from one of the most annoying cards in the format. The thing is, one of the only things that deck really had to worry about was Agent of Treachery if you didn't mutate onto a Paradise Druid. And then things get really ugly if your opponent does have Agent. The exiting of Agent, I think, might actually help this deck. Also, the exiting of Fires of Invention, I think, might help out the Mutate deck a good bit, because Mutate feels a little bit like a mid-range deck. It feels a little bit like it cheats on mana with Auspicious Sterix. So Auspicious Sterix might be the best way to cheat on mana. Formerly, that was Fires of Invention, but now it could very well be this card. But I guess the final point I have for now, there is a lot to talk about, and we may just continue this discussion in the comments section or even in a later video, depending on how the format shakes out. But for now, what I think is probably the just best deck because of this announcement is Temur Reclamation. A deck that was probably already vying for the top spot, and it doesn't really have to play a companion or anything, I think that Temur doesn't really want to see the rise of counterspells in this format either, but it's a really versatile deck. A lot of people have the impression that Temur Reclamation just tries to resolve Wilderness Reclamation and then a huge expansion explosion, and that's all it's got going for it. That's not true. This deck can kill you with all kinds of things. Some of these run, Nightpack Ambusher. Most of them run Bone Crusher Giant, Brazen Borrower, all that. There are a lot of ways this deck can kill you if it doesn't get its main plan. And it's going to continue to be able to do that. It doesn't really play any of the cards that got banned. It didn't really play companions most of the time. Sometimes it tries to work in companions, but by and large, it hasn't really worked for the deck because it doesn't need that. The deck can win counterspell wars against everything except for Dovin's Veto, something I'm a little bit worried about. That's why I brought up Dovin's Veto earlier. It's because I think that Temur Reclamation is probably one of the best decks easily day one of this new format, and Dovin's Veto is very, very good against this deck. However, like I've said, it plays creatures it can win the game with too. It also plays sweepers in case it runs up against creature decks, so it's just a really versatile, multi-dimensional deck that's already been knocking on the door of like best deck in Standard, and considering it really doesn't play too many of the cards or any of the cards that are affected by this announcement, I just think it's easy to make the call that it's probably the best deck in Standard now. Which is lame, because it's one of the most annoying decks to play with on Arena. It really is. I do not like playing with Temur Reclamation. Really, I don't mind playing with Wilderness Reclamation. I just mind the, timing everything correctly at the end of your turn and not roping out while you're trying to tap all your mana, and then you resolve the trigger on Wilderness Reclamation and you tap all your mana, and then you resolve the trigger on the second Wilderness Reclamation, you tap all your mana, and by then you're out of rope. You feel like you're playing against yourself when you're playing Reclamation on Arena some of the time. It's not a super fun deck to try to resolve that one explosion at the end of the game. Can be actually stressful because you're racing against the clock. So that's all I've got for now, but again, all these opinions are subject to change as the format evolves and opens up. We've got a couple more weeks in the current format, and then on, I think it's June 25th, Core Set 2021 becomes available to play on Arena, so we've really got like 3 weeks of this format left. And then the format will change again. So a lot of really exciting stuff happening, and it's going to be fun playing Magic for the next 3 weeks while we do try to figure out what are the best things in this format. Give me your 2 cents down there, because there's a lot of stuff I didn't get to. I tried to keep the video relatively tight. But, one of the reasons that Wizards said they banned Agent of Treachery specifically was because they felt like people couldn't play, decks based around big creatures, big permanents and stuff. So do those decks become more viable now? I mean, I guess we'll have to see. Just give me your 2 cents in the comment section. I read your comments. We'll try to continue the discussion down there, because there's, again, a lot that I wasn't able to get to today. But aside from that, just do all the YouTube stuff. Like the video, share it around so more people get the news. It's important. Also, subscribe if you haven't done it yet. Lots of news, lots of decks, lots of gameplay, and of course, those Core 2021 spoilers coming up. You want to be subbed for all that, hit the bell for the notification. Check out the Patreon. You want to support content like this. $1 a month lets you vote on what content we even do. So get all that together, do that stuff, and I suppose I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love, be kind, and stand for justice.